2, 1.
Good morning and welcome to the Climate Minnesota webinar. I'm Josna Harris, Education Coordinator at Climate Generation, a Will Steger legacy, and I'm joined today with a great lineup of speakers who you can see at the bottom of your screen. They're representing different regions throughout our state. We have Siri from Collegeville, Minnesota, in the central part of our state. We have Rose Clark from Crookston, and she's up in the northwest corner. Kristen Foster, who's joining us from Mountain Iron in the Iron Range region. Elizabeth Dunbar from NPR News. She joins us from the St. Paul offices. And we have Mayor Brady joining us from Rochester down south. And I'm also joined by my colleagues, Kristen Poppleton, Director of Education at Climate Generation, and Megan Van Loo, our Programs Coordinator. And we're in our office in Minneapolis. And you'll be able to meet both of them in just a bit. We're here today to celebrate the 12 Climate Minnesota convenings that Climate Generation has hosted in local communities across the state. And we're excited to share elements from conversations started at convenings and where we hope to go from here. But before we go further, we want to acknowledge that funding for today's webinar comes from the Environment and Natural Resources Trust Fund and the McKnight Foundation. We also want to say a big thank you to the many partnerships that have made Climate Minnesota happen on the local and grassroots levels, and also with support from the state through the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, the Environmental Quality Board, and the Minnesota Department of Commerce. The depth of community engagement realized simply would not have been possible without these invaluable relationships. We also want to give a special shout out to our friends at the Regional Sustainable Development Partnerships who worked alongside us to co-host 5 of these convenings. To share a bit personally, Minnesota has always been my home, but in 2015, I actually saw more of the state than I had in my entire lifetime. Climate Minnesota has been an incredible journey, and needless to say, our team gathered some great memories throughout traveling the back roads, including hiking near the top of our state at the beautiful Rydell National Wildlife Refuge, literally just a hop off of the road on our way from Bemidji to Crookston. The amazing local media coverage on nearly all of the convenings, stories that we were sure to spur even more conversations. Sampling delicious local fare at places like Chester Creek Cafe in Duluth. And how we figured out how to stay hopeful about this daunting subject with random yet frequent bouts of goofiness. Of course, though, it's been the people who have left us with a lasting impression. People who've welcomed us with more than just Minnesota nice. We know that Minnesotans care about climate change. We know this because they've shared their values, concerns, and stories with us. This morning, we're going to share the momentum ignited through the convenings. You'll hear what we've learned, ripple effects inspired, and then we'll round out our time with 2 fabulous climate stories. It's a full agenda, so let's get started. I'm going to hand it off to Kristen Poppleton, our Director of Education at Climate Generation, who will share more about the convenings themselves and what we've learned from them. Kristen?
Thanks, Josna. And thanks to everyone out there this morning joining us. Hopefully you have a good cup of coffee in front of you and you can enjoy the next hour of fantastic speakers and stories. So as Josna mentioned, exactly actually a year ago to the day, we left on the road to see Minnesota and to talk to people about climate change. We had a really deliberately planned program that was based on research. What people said was the way we should talk about climate change. We had connected with folks that were doing really amazing things in Minnesota, but we honestly had no idea what we were going to find. And if we were going to make a difference out there on the road. We learned a lot. We had a lot of success. We also, as I said, learned a lot. And I will say that When our first convening in Bemidji, which like I said happened today, I wish we could go back and do it again because we really learned a lot about small things that could make a difference in a 2.5-hour time slot, which is what our convenings were focused on. And so this morning, during my brief little bit here, I'm going to give you a quick peek at what a convening looked like. Although you're kind of getting a sample from this webinar this morning that gives a feel of how it worked. The thought that went into the design, and then some of the things that we've seen so far have happened. And so with that, I'm going to share my screen and talk about what Climate Minnesota came out of. So Climate Minnesota is based on the knowledge that Minnesota is truly in a state of change. Our temperatures are rising, our precipitation patterns have changed, our biological communities are changing, we're seeing impacts on public health, but we also have a lot of amazing things happening related to solutions to climate change mitigation, climate change adaptation. And as I mentioned, these convenings were designed based on what we know so far about how to talk to people about climate. And we're going to write up a formal report, and you can see what our theoretical framework was if you're interested in that. But I wanted to share something that maybe was a little bit more fun that came across my desk last week. And this was an article from the environmental news, it's an online environmental news source, Grist. And in it they shared everything we know about how to talk about climate change. And as we read through this, we felt like we were reading a checklist of the things that we had learned from our Climate Minnesota convenings. And so I wanted to use their framework as sort of a way to share what happened in our convenings. The first thing they said was, tell a story rather than reciting facts, and put people at the heart of that story. At each of our convenings, we featured stories, 3 stories from community members that could talk about how they had experienced climate change there in their community and solutions that they were connected to. Tailor that story to your audience. These convenings fundamentally were local and really focused on what was happening in Crookston, what was happening in Rochester, how had climate change impacted that community, and what was happening solutions-wise, and how could people connect. Focus on solutions. Each convening featured workshops. They weren't workshops put on by people from somewhere else in the state or in the country. They were workshops put on by people in those communities that were doing something and connect the participants to those resources and solutions. Talk about how we'll be remembered in the future. One of my favorite things that Josna says in every convening is, I don't know about you, but when my future grandchildren look back on history and ask me when I first knew about this dilemma and what I did to help fight it, I want to tell them with certainty that I did everything I could with what I was given. So the messaging within these convenings was thinking about this. How will we be remembered? Get kids in on the game. We were lucky enough to feature youth stories on a number of our panels, but I'll say that one of my favorite convenings was our last one in Albany, where we partnered with a youth organization called Yes to put on a convening that was in majority planned by youth and put on by youth and with workshops by youth. And so those youth bring in a different audience. They bring in their parents. They bring in their peers. And that was a really great focus for us. Don't try to scare people. We had a very big solutions focus, as I mentioned, and so trying to actually talk about those impacts, but what we can do is important. We didn't rely on cheesy stock photos. Our photos were authentic. That doesn't mean they were always that awesome, but they also were the photos that storytellers provided for each of their stories. Don't get discouraged that you can't reach everyone. This was something that we do feel slightly discouraged, I would say, about. It's one of the outcomes of this project, is we weren't able to always get the whole community at these convenings. But this also challenges us for the what's next part of this project. How can we bring in different stories from the communities that we didn't bring in? and just talk about it. Well, the focus on these convenings was storytelling, and one of our solutions was storytelling. And so really asking people to share those stories was an important piece. So now, one of the other, and so what we found is it worked. We built capacity in our communities. We connected people to resources they could actually connect with after the convening. And people actually did take action. There's people that committed to reducing energy, to gardening solutions, and conversations, just talking about it. One of the things that we asked in each of our convenings was, what do you value most about your community? Asking people to start thinking about their own personal story. And so today we're asking everyone out in the audience to think about that as well. And in one word, that's one word, think about that and email me that word today, and I will get it ideally before the end of this webinar, and we'll be sharing something that hopefully looks like this. This is what people in Minnesota value most about their communities. This is the summary of all of our convenings, what people shared. And so please send that, Kristen at climategen.org, to me, and I will be putting that together today, sharing what we all value most about our community. So I'll be looking for those emails, thanks, and I'm going to pass it back over to Josna.
Thanks, Kristen. Thanks, Kristen. For sharing that backstory and our reflection in Minnesota, and for setting the tone by asking us to reflect on what we value most. Next, we're going to turn it over to some of our local partners who are leading their communities in deeper engagement around climate change solutions, what we're calling ripple effects. We'll hear from Mayor Ardell Brady in Rochester and Rose Clark, a member of the Citizen Bike Coalition in Crookston. First, I'd like to introduce Mayor Ardell Brady of Rochester, who's going to share how local efforts have stepped up since he announced the ambitious and exciting goal for Rochester to achieve 100% renewable energy by 2031 at our Rochester convening last fall. So Mayor Brady, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much. I hope the transmission is working right. It's kind of choppy at times, so we'll hope that it goes through smoothly. Well, thank you, and thanks to all of the participants this morning and those that have joined in. Yes, last year, October 12th in 2015, we did this proclamation, and as I said at the time, when you sign your name to something, I think it means a little bit more. It gives a little more power to it all. There's two sentences I want to just bring out of that proclamation. One of them, it starts out with, whereas in order to ensure a livable planet for current and future generations, we urgently need to build societies powered by safe, affordable, and sustainable energy. And then the resolved is that together we will strive to achieve a goal of attaining 100% renewable energy by 2031, and we go on to say what that would include. 2031 for us is that we have a contract with our Rochester Public Utility where they get a lot of the power that goes through 2030, and so anything we do to reduce that, we still have a contract that we're buying that amount of power. But that's not going to deter us from moving forward. And some of the things that have happened, I guess the ripple effect. Yesterday, just yesterday, one of the grade schools here in town, fifth graders, they wanted to hear more about this proclamation. So I went there, talked to those students, and they were excited. They want to add solar panels to their school. And we have 3 public schools, high schools right now that have those panels. And I learned that those panels on each school is enough to power the 4 classrooms in those schools. And so just when you think of that, so over the city, that's 12 of those classrooms that's happening. So we're doing more and more regarding that. Overall, it's an awareness. I think people understand it, but maybe until somebody really signed their name to something, it's really made a difference, and so we move forward. Another thing that's happened, and we have a historic theater that was a Barnes & Noble bookstore that's going to go back to being a real theater again. It has a marquee on it that has 950 light bulbs on it that twinkle all the time. They are incandescent. We are going to be converting all of those to LED lights, and that will have a 9-year life versus the life that's now probably measured in months. Also, it'll reduce the energy consumption. It'll go down to using only 10% of what we have today. Excuse me. So that makes a big difference. The other side of that is we won't have staff people having to climb up and change light bulbs probably every other week. Earth Day is coming up. We have a major events happening here in Rochester with trees being given away. Park Department's working on it, Rochester Public Utilities. Excuse me, our neighbors will be planting upwards of 1,000 trees throughout the city. So things are happening all around the community. It is an awareness. Obviously, most of the appliances we buy today are much more efficient. So almost without effort, we're saving energy, and people are being able to do that. So it's an honor for me to be able to, first of all, sign the proclamation, create the energy, if you will, that came from that. I didn't realize doing that it would not only affect Rochester, but I heard that it was statewide, nationwide, and somebody said it was even being reported in Europe about that. So one person can make a difference. You don't have to be the mayor. You can be the citizens, which are where the real action is. And I thank you again for my opportunity to be a part of this webinar this morning.
Well, thank you, Mayor Brady. We're honored to have you here, and it's so encouraging to hear how you've stepped up and taken leadership on this, and how local people are responding by stepping up themselves and really meeting this challenge that you've set. Thank you. Next, we have Rose with the Crookston Bike Project, a new grassroots effort pushing for Crookston to be a more bike-friendly town, while also meeting steps to advance Crookston as a Green Step city. We were lucky to partner with the City of Crookston at our convening back in April, almost exactly a year ago, where they presented a solutions workshop on their new status as a Green Step in the Green Step program. Rose Clark is a community outreach corps member with the U of M's Regional Sustainable Development Partnerships. So I'll hand it over to you, Rose.
Awesome, thank you. Yeah, so I'm up here in Crookston, Minnesota, working on a lot of things, supporting the Regional Sustainable Development Partnerships, and also working on some projects like this one here in town. This is, Jyotsna introduced me a little bit. I'm an AmeriCorps volunteer with the Conservation Corps of Minnesota and Iowa, working on a 1-year commitment to serve in the RSDP, which, if you're interested in learning more about what we do, we support community-driven projects with funding and university connections. So if you have an idea for a project, go there and you can get connected. And like I said, my job is to support the natural resource focus area, but I'm also working on some local projects as well. The logo looks very official, but it's kind of deceiving because we are not a standalone project. We're kind of a bunch of people who want to see biking expand in our community. And we hope to be an inspiration to other small cities looking to do this in their towns. So, Crookston, Minnesota, not a ton of people have been here. It's kind of way up in the northwest corner, right by Grand Forks, North Dakota, just north of Fargo. We're a town of about 8,000 people, and we do have a U of M campus up north where the orange dot is on the map. It's really interesting. There's only about 900 students on campus, and there's about 900 students online. So it's a very big kind of commuter place. A lot of people work in Grand Forks and live in Crookston. It's a very car-centric infrastructure and culture right along Highway 2. But the town is only about 4 miles north to south. I just moved here in September from Portland, Oregon, and I had never owned a car until 2 weeks ago. I mainly commuted by bike, and my commute the last year was about 4 miles, but I have not bike commuted once yet. At first it was because I didn't have a bike, and now it's because partly the cold and wind, but also it's really hard. People here aren't looking for bicyclists. There's not a lot of bike parking. There are no designated bike lanes, although there are some multi-use paths along Highway 2. So there's some potential, but it's really not, at the moment, it's not very bike friendly. It's not very inviting, but there is a lot of potential. In the town, there's a lot happening about downtown revitalization, economic stimulus. We're kind of just on the edge of being able to support local businesses sustainably, in that with about 8,000 people, many of whom don't necessarily spend a lot of time downtown, it's hard to maintain a business. So we're working on things like that. There's a lot of focus on active living. There's a wellness coalition that's got a really diverse and active group of people on it, working on expanding that and access throughout different economic groups, strengthening the community. I'm also helping to lead a community garden that also is in line with the Green Steps project, and generally reducing our nutrient and carbon impacts. This is a very agricultural area as well. So like I said, the bike project, or the collaborative, or the coalition, whatever you want to call it, it's just a bunch of people coming from different groups representing different jobs and perspectives. And we're hoping to encourage active living and community connections through bicycle access, education, and infrastructure. As was said before, we had a climate convening, one of the first ones, I think, April 15th, so a year ago tomorrow, 2015. And here you can see on the screen the list of the things that people valued about their cities. This is kind of what Kristen was saying earlier. And as you can see, hunting, wetlands, nature, kind of the small and local community, those are really valuable here. The kind of ironic thing is that everyone involved right now with the bike project, no one was at that convening, but I think it's really telling that there's this general momentum for sustainability happening, and so the conversations that happened there helped to set the stage for what we're trying to do now. And on the right-hand side of the screen there, you can see all the different logos for different partners that are all working towards this goal. The U of M, Regional Sustainable Development Partnerships, the Polk County Public Health folks have been super helpful. That kind of river design is Crookston in Motion. They are looking to expand trails and access to different active living things. The statewide health improvement plan has also been great, and the city of Crookston just refreshed their strategic plan to include a lot of sustainability goals. And we are currently, I think, applying for our second green step, and the bike project is definitely one of those things that came out of that. So what's the vision? At one of our first meetings of this working group, we just kind of all sat down and listed out on big picture paper our motivations, which I think was really helpful because we all have the same end goal, but we have different reasons for going there. My motivations are partly selfish. I love biking. I love the connection to the community and the outdoors that it gives me. People are much likely to stop and talk to one another or stop into a shop that looks interesting if they're on a bike, versus a car that they have to worry about parking and turning off and turning back on. So I find that to be my main motivation. Others from Polk County Public Health are looking to increase access to different groups, whether they are low income, mid income, just kind of overweight and looking for ways to build activity into their day. Folks at the university are looking to provide access to different transportation for international students and domestic students. And then there's this kind of universal desire to educate, so that share the road symbol. Just make people on the road aware of bicyclists and make both bicyclists and drivers know the laws. And then also building in the infrastructure of bike lanes or designated bike trails on our pretty light traffic back roads, and working in art and bike parking to our downtown as part of the revitalization. There are a lot of people here who would think that there's a season for biking in this region. In Portland, you can pretty much bike all year round as long as you have rain gear, but here you need a little bit more dedication and warm clothes and snow tires. But we're looking to make it a more accessible form of transportation, to mitigate our climate change impact, to connect with each other and our downtown, and to do all these things considering all the different perspectives that we have at the table. So I'd be happy to connect with anyone who has questions or suggestions for us. My information is on the screen there. And that's actually, so give me a call or email, and I'd love to collaborate. So thank you.
Great, thanks, Rose. What you've described is more than a grassroots movement in the community. It's pushing for behavior and cultural change, and it's really encouraging to hear about. One of the most challenging aspects of dealing with climate change is that it's invisible, and progress is really hard to see. And that's why tangible conversations like the one that we're having today is so important. And hearing about what local communities are doing is proof that people are working together to create change and to try to find solutions. And it's also a reminder that we're not alone in this. Thanks so much for sharing, Mayor Brady and Rose. Next, we're going to hear from Elizabeth Dunbar. We're excited to hear her reflections on reporting on climate change. And so for this introduction, I'm going to turn it over to Megan, our programs coordinator, for this introduction.
Great. So if you guys want to keep submitting your words to Kristen at climategen.org, we can compile that wordle for later about what you value most about your community in one word. But to build consensus and understanding on climate change, we need reliable news coverage that accurately portrays the issue from multiple angles. And so we're really happy to have Elizabeth Dunbar with us here today to share her experiences and reflections in reporting on all things climate change. So Elizabeth Dunbar has been a reporter for NPR News since 2009 and currently covers the environment and climate change. In 2015, she co-reported a series on climate change in Minnesota that won a Kavli Science Journalism Award from the American Association for the Advancement of Science. Previously, Dunbar reported and edited for the Associated Press in Minneapolis, Louisville, Kentucky, and Raleigh, North Carolina. Dunbar grew up in Iowa and graduated from the University of Minnesota with a degree in journalism and political science in 2004. Her first reporting job was at the Minnesota Daily. So I'm going to turn it over to Elizabeth now.
Hi, everybody. I've got a timer running. I'm going to do a PowerPoint, and we'll see if we have time for questions afterward. Let's just get this up here. Okay. All right, so I'm going to just talk about reporting on climate change, some of the challenges that journalists like me face. I'm going to talk about how we as journalists help people understand complex topics. Climate change can be complicated a lot of times, especially when you're talking about the effects on natural ecosystems. And then how should the media frame climate change? And I'll give my take on that, and I look forward to your questions as well. So first, I just have a few cartoons that kind of describe these challenges that journalists face. So I'll give you a second to look at that. So this issue is really complicated. People don't understand the science of how this is happening. And sometimes it's education level. Sometimes it's was it covered wherever they went to school. There's a lot of noise, mixed messages coming from interest groups. And sometimes the journalists themselves don't understand the science, or their editors don't. And so that leads to some coverage that makes it even more confusing for people. And here's another challenge here. So it's this climate versus weather confusion. People are very, very attached to what's going on with the weather today. But climate change obviously is looking at a longer average of the weather. And so one way I like to think about it is weather is what you're wearing today. Climate is what clothes you have in your wardrobe. In Minnesota, we have our winter clothes, we have our summer clothes, and you kind of put away. I'm hoping we'll be able to get our summer clothes out pretty soon here. But that's one way to think about it, is all the different kinds of gear that you have to be prepared for to deal with Minnesota's climate. And one more. So there's the pace of climate change seems really slow to people, and there's this feeling out there that this is going to be gradual, we'll have plenty of time to adapt. And so in news organizations, when we're dealing with things like shootings, politics, elections, things that are demanding our time and attention on a daily basis, it's sometimes hard to get editors, to get journalists interested in paying more attention to this issue. And it also doesn't always hit home for people. They think, oh, climate change is happening somewhere else, and they don't think that what they're experiencing is really affecting them or will in the future. That it's just hard to grasp sometimes. So I'm going to play one audio clip. I have 3 here, but I'm just going to explain first some ways that journalists help people understand a complex topic like climate change. And these will look familiar. Some of them will look familiar to the list that Kristen gave at the beginning in how to talk about climate change. So one is show, don't tell. So rather than just saying that something is going on, find a way to show it's happening, find the people that can make people think about it and relate to it better, and put it in terms people can understand. So one way that I do that is analogies. Can you think of something else that people would definitely understand, and then use that to explain the more complicated idea. And then this is something that we did in our series on climate change that ran in February 2015, and that is there is some uncertainty here, and rather than just glossing over it and focusing only on the things that we do know, we did delve into some of the science, some of the debate. One of the things that people were trying to figure out is, okay, why in 2014, when we had sort of the polar vortex winter, when everything was just frigid here on the East Coast, how could that happen in a world where climate change is happening and we're supposed to be having warmer temperatures? And there was actually a link to climate change in that, but that's an area of science that is still being researched. And so we brought that to people, but also put some caveats that there's still a lot that we don't know, and that scientists are trying to figure some things out. So I'm just going to give you one example of the show don't tell, and this was from our story. We wanted to show, you know, that Minnesota had a long record of temperature data, and that by that data we could understand that the climate was changing. So I'm just going to play that really quick.
The National Weather Service now has a network of 163 observers in Minnesota. Like clockwork, the volunteers send in daily temperature and precipitation data. That includes Milan. It's a town of 350 in western Minnesota with deep Norwegian roots. Luther Upjordan's farm is the local source of weather information here. They were born Memorial Day. 3 kittens follow Upjordan on his daily visit to the temperature house. It's a white box overlooking the farm. 2 large glass thermometers inside record the daily high and low temperatures.
You spin the bottom one to bring that down to 48. So it's ready for taking our temperature for the next day.
Upjordan has recorded temperatures as low as 33 below and as high as 100. Those extremes don't tell us much about the climate in Milan, but Upjordan's family has been at this for 3 generations. And their combined 121 years of daily weather observations do reveal a trend. On average, the temperature is about 2 degrees warmer than when Olaus Upjordan made his first observations here in 1893.
Okay, so that was just an example of finding a person that can demonstrate this idea that we have the data to show that Minnesota is warming. Okay, so then I want to just talk a little bit about how should journalists frame climate change. In our series, we decided to make a decision about not going to people who basically reject the science. We decided not to make that any part of our coverage. That the facts showed that the climate was changing, and the mechanics of that were agreed upon by scientists. And I'm just going to show you kind of, this is John Oliver's take on sort of how some media have been covering climate change. And especially TV news will often frame it as a debate. And so here he's going to make fun of that. I hope this works here.
Good evening. Joining me tonight, a climate change denier and naturally Bill Nye Science Guy. Climate change? No question. Wait. Before we begin, in the interest of mathematical balance, I'm going to bring out 2 people who agree with you, climate skeptic, and Bill Nye, I'm also going to bring out 96 other scientists. Please dial in. Again, this is going to make the debate difficult. We shouldn't really be having it in the first place. But, so, representationally, climate skeptic, please make a case against climate change.
Well, I just don't think all the science is in yet. It's settled.
Okay, and what is the overwhelming view of the entire scientific community?
Okay, so that was John Oliver talking about some of the TV news, how they basically present it as a 50-50 proposition when really there is scientific consensus about this. And so, yeah, like I said, we treated it as there is no debate about this, and the audience feedback that we got from that series was mostly positive. There were people that wrote into us that rejected the basic science of this and said it, you know, the climate is not changing, and but that was really a minority of the feedback that we got from people. And then, so if there is no debate about whether man-made climate change exists, where is there debate? And there is plenty of debate out there, and this is sort of an outline of some of the things that I'm paying attention to. One is the question of mitigation. Should we stop burning fossil fuels? And that might seem like a no-brainer to most of the people that are on this webinar, but there are a lot of people out there in powerful positions in legislatures, in Congress, that don't believe we should stop burning fossil fuels, or they believe we should replace coal plants with natural gas, or different things like that. And so there is a debate about mitigation, how fast we need to stop burning fossil fuels. The Obama administration's Clean Power Plan, and how aggressive that should be. You'll hear a debate a lot about how oh, it's China and India, and even if we stop burning fossil fuels, the rest of the world isn't going to, and so we're not going to make a difference. So you'll hear a lot of different things along those lines. The effects of climate change. So to what extent is climate change to blame for weather events is one of them. That's a question that recently there's been some high-profile journalists that have said, well, and scientists who have said, well, climate change is affecting everything, and it used to be that they would say, oh, well, you can't attach one weather event to climate change. But now you'll hear more people saying, well, climate change is affecting everything that we see in the weather in some way, even if we can't fully explain what's happening. And there are a lot of people working on that, including some researchers at the University of Minnesota. And then the other thing out there is adaptation. And should we prepare? How much money should we put in to adapting to some of the effects that we see, the changing precipitation patterns, the warming temperatures? Is it worth it to build our infrastructure with larger pipes? Or are there other less expensive ways to control the amount of stormwater runoff in urban areas? So those types of questions are still out there, and are definitely things that I'm paying a lot of attention to. So yeah, this is just a very small list. There's a lot more here of implications that climate change has for Minnesota, and some of the things that I'm paying attention to and trying to write stories about. And then I'll just leave you with this picture here from the MPCA. It's a picture of algae, and that's a story that I'm working on right now, is what are the connections between algae and climate change. So I don't know if we have a couple minutes for questions, but I'd be happy to either take them by email or during the webinar.
Great, thank you, Elizabeth. I know that Kristen has been vetting some of the words that we got and the questions, so we can continue to take those, maybe address those in a few minutes. Kristen, do you want to take it away? Okay.
Sorry.
So
I was muted. I was talking. I was like, why isn't anyone responding? I know my screen is shared too. I think we'll move on. We don't have any questions in at this point, but if people want to send some, but I think in the interest of time this morning too, just because we're moving forward, we can move on just to the next part. But thank you, Elizabeth. We'll let you know if any questions come in while we are moving forward. Sound good?
Great. Well, thanks, Elizabeth, for sharing. For so long, the dominant narrative on climate change communication has been from a science perspective. So I love the comics and demonstrating the impacts that we hear about. through showing real-life examples and stories. We have a culture of convenience and entertainment and communications that reflect this while still being scientifically accurate. Really makes something that feels abstract into something that I can relate to. So I appreciate that. Thank you. So if you'd like to learn more about Elizabeth's reporting, you can find links through the webinars tab on climateminnesota.org. This morning we're going to wrap up our time together with a bit of storytelling and what has been my favorite aspect of Climate Minnesota. The local stories shared at the convenings through the storytelling panel and through the storytelling solutions workshops have shown a real demonstration of an authentic community dialogue. And for the storytellers themselves, often it has been a transformative process. They're making public their eyewitness accounts on climate change, vocalizing their values, and sometimes even making a plea to their peers. These stories have really personalized climate change while also making a relevance to the places that we live and really making a case for why we should all care about this issue. So before we hear from our storytellers, though, we want to circle back to the question that we asked earlier about what you value most about your community. So we put together this Wordle as a collective compilation of your values. So we'd like you to think about your word as you listen to the stories ahead and how it might serve as a meaningful motivator for you making this issue personal, and possibly it might even be the spark for your own story. Here to share climate stories are Kristen Foster and Siri Berg Moberg. First, I'd like to introduce to you Kristen with her story, Iron Filings, the Iron Range Conundrum. Kristen Foster is an ordained minister of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America and the pastor of Messiah Lutheran Church of Mountain Iron, Minnesota. She's a founding board member on the Iron Range Partnership for Sustainability, which organizes the Iron Range Earth Fest, now in its 8th year. And she also chairs the steering committee for the Congregations Caring for the Earth that hosts an annual 100-mile harvest meal, and is also the chairperson of the Northeastern Minnesota Synod ELCA's Creation Care Team. Members of her congregation now are about to launch the area's first community kitchen with a community garden and greenhouse. Kristen?
Well, thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this webinar today. I've already learned so much and wish I were taking notes as we went along. So here's my story. Minnesota's Iron Range is my acquired home, mine and my husband's. Its beauty and its magnetism are an acquired taste. Pockmarked by mine pits, the horizon silhouetted by the broad, grassy anvils of reclaimed mine dumps, with flat expanses previously logged but now scrubbed by spruce and aspen, the topography here displays our economics, past and present. Willows take hold in the once tended pastures of abandoned farms. The original main streets of its towns compete for the greatest square footage of architecture etched with the collapse of earlier aspirations. These are the unmistakable signs that we are altering the landscape of our communities and our earth with unsustainable forms of production and consumption. In the midst of these less than lovely features, however, a resilient spirit of cultural and economic renewal stubbornly manifests itself in arts, culture, and entrepreneurship. For over 27 years, one of those towns, Mountain Iron, has been the place where I have served as pastor. For over 20 years, one of those farms has been ours. The Iron Range is my home. Its peculiar beauty and resiliency has etched itself into our family landscape and is now not only part of our history, but ultimately of our legacy. I imagine with thick foreboding what climate changes will do to our woods, fields, and gardens over the next few decades. I see those signs even now in the shorter winters, more erratic rainfall, the appearance of more families of foxes in the fields, and raccoons migrating from garbage can to garbage can. People who grow up on the Iron Range have iron filings in their blood, it is said around here, which eventually draws them back home. This saying refers to the dominant economic history which gives the Iron Range its name. there was logging, then came mining, first iron, then taconite, more recently, the troubled prospect of copper and nickel mining. Call this an economy of extraction, where work depends on what can be removed from the ground and shipped elsewhere, most of the profits included. Those who use the phrase iron filings in the blood know, however, that the magnetism that brings people back to the range is not metallurgical, but relational and ecological. Through thick and thin, iron rangers are fiercely loyal to their neighbors and their kin. They are perennially resourceful, and they love the land and water. This piece of earth is their home. There were no iron filings in our blood when my husband and I moved to northeastern Minnesota. We just wanted to be closer to wilderness canoeing and cross-country skiing. We imagined ourselves perched somewhere along the magnificence that is Lake Superior. Instead, a counseling position in Hibbing for my husband and the call to serve a Lutheran church on the edge of an open-pit mine brought us 65 miles up the road from Duluth to Mountain Iron. I have been learning the human and ecological history of this new home ever since. As a pastor, I get to do listening for a living. Personal stories are laced with that history. The personal habits of my parishioners are shaped around seasonal opportunities for being outdoors. Life on the range is a rhythm of fishing, gardening, lake dwelling, hunting, snow sports, and ice fishing. So this is the conundrum. People here love this land, this water, these seasons, yet mining has historically been the economic foundation of their livelihood. Even with the history of labor struggle and mining-related health hazards, when hard questions about proposed copper-nickel sulfide mining were first raised about the long-term risks it could pose to human health and ecosystems, lawn signs sprang up all over proclaiming, "We support mining," and "mining supports us." Such an either-or message does not foster dialogue about our shared future. At the same time, however, there are many people here who understand that on the Iron Range, as indeed everywhere, we need a wider lens, one in which the means of making a living and the means to sustain life itself do not exclude one another. In fact, they cannot. Drawing on the resilient spirit and love of place so deeply rooted here, these Iron Rangers are stimulating conversation and action to find new pathways that will strengthen community, invigorate a local economy, and steward the land and water. This is what gives me hope and part of what keeps me here. Responsible action for the common good must always contend with profound conundrums. The Iron Range's conundrums have their own distinct edges and crevices, but they are no harder than the conundrums where you may live. May we all draw strength and wisdom from one another's stories as we seek ways to care for and restore our common home for the common good. Thank you.
Thanks, Kristen. I really appreciate you sharing from your heart and so articulately painting the picture of the conundrum that the Iron Range is facing. It's a unique perspective and so very important. Thank you.
Thank you.
Next, Siri Berg, who is joining us from Collegeville, Minnesota, will share a pond hockey story. Siri is currently a senior studying biology and political science at the College of St. Benedict, where she played hockey for the Blazers. She's originally from St. Paul, Minnesota. Siri practically grew up in the outdoors and loves to bike, canoe, rock climb, hike, just about anything that will get her outside. Siri?
Hi, thank you so much for having me today. This story is one that I first wrote and kind of came up with at Climate Minnesota's Albany convening not very long ago, like a month and a half ago. So here's my pond hockey story. Some of the best memories I have from growing up are from playing pond hockey. I used to spend hours and hours of my evenings as a kid playing with my friends and my family at the neighborhood rink near my school. I practically lived there from the time the ice was ready in December until it became too warm to skate in March. During that time, I'd play after school and after practice well into the evening, even sometimes after the lights were turned off and the warming house closed. There's really nothing else quite like it. I've always loved the feeling of the cold air on my face, contrasted starkly with the heat from exercise and exertion. I used to play until I was so exhausted I could hardly move, but I still couldn't resist taking another shot, scoring another goal, or stopping my opponents, some of whom who were many, many years older than I. And although the days of my spending every single evening and every waking moment out at the rink are over, playing pond hockey is still one of my favorite winter activities. And it's something I look forward to when the snow starts to fall and when the weather starts to turn every autumn. It's a huge reason why I love the sport and why I was able to continue playing through college. Unfortunately, the last couple years have been poor winters for outdoor ice. The window has seemed to shrink, and undoubtedly it's a product of climate change. Now, it may be hard to imagine for Minnesotans who are hardy in the winter, but good skating ice isn't easy to make. Ice is very finicky. It changes quality with the slightest change in the weather. If it's too cold when the water freezes, then the ice becomes liable to shatter when you skate on it. If it cracks off, it can crack off in big, thin sheets the size of dinner plates, sliding across the surface of the ice as you try and move. If it's too warm, the ice will look cloudy, becoming a pale white color instead of the ideal shade of steely gray. Pockets of air will form that can turn the ice to slush. Blades sink in, and skating begins to feel more like wading than flying. Sometimes these air pockets form from the ground up, and big sections of ice will break off and fall down when you put pressure on them. It also can't be snowing when you try and flood the rink with water. If snow falls while water freezes, the ice will turn out gritty and pebbly rather than smooth and solid. It takes lots and lots and lots of time and patience and energy to make good ice. It can take a few weeks of consistent flooding in the evenings to get a rink started in the winter, but only a couple of unseasonably warm days to undo all of that. This winter was a particularly bad one for outdoor ice. People say that it's the fault of El Niño, but I don't really believe that's the only force at work here. We've had El Niño years before, but this year was different. It was one of the worst years for outdoor ice that I can remember, and I'd rather not have it happen again, but I fear climate change will only make things worse. Not just for outdoor ice, but for activities like skiing and sledding and snowshoeing, everything that we like to do outside in the winter. Without major changes, who knows how much longer we'll be able to skate outside in the wintertime? Who knows if the next generation of Minnesota kids will be able to even have that opportunity. Thank you.
Thanks, Siri. I love your story, and even though I really cannot relate at all to your love for ice, my parents came from India, and so playing on a frozen lake or on ice was never something that seemed natural or that was advocated for. Yet I grew up in Minnesota, and so really imagining and understanding something that you value so much and deeply care for is something that I can relate to. So to hear more stories, you can access our entire collection at climateminnesota.org. At Climate Generation, we believe that we all have a climate story to tell, and so we invite you to share yours to build on this collective narrative, because we know that climate stories can be a really powerful tool to communicate to others on climate change and really personalize how things are changing for yourself. So we're defining a climate story as a personal story about an experience, place, or time that's linked to how you're feeling the impacts of our changing climate, or simply why you care about climate change. You can share your story in written form or as a podcast via audio recording at climateminnesota.org. So you can also go there to find out more and to share your story. We've appreciated sharing this morning with you, and it's always refreshing to hear about what other people are doing in response to climate change, and also what they value most and how that can oftentimes play a motivating factor. Our hope is that you'll be able to use what you've learned and thought about today to encourage other conversations in your own community and to connect with resources locally to engage in solutions. We invite you all to stay connected to Climate Generation, and you can do that by visiting climategen.org. And a recording of today's webinar will also be available online, so you can feel free to share it with your networks who may have missed it. So thanks for joining us, everyone.